Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Teresa Welsh. I am a senior reporter with Devex. I write our food systems newsletter, Devex Dish, and write our food systems coverage. Today, I'm so pleased to be moderating this event that Devex is producing in partnership with the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, in which we are going to be talking about the future of small-scale farming in Africa and the importance of outcomes from COP26 that we just saw wrap and how that's going to affect the future productivity, resilience of African small-scale farmers. We're so pleased to be hosting this event today. A couple of notes here at the top. Something that we're really excited to have a part of this event today is we're going to have an illustrator that is going to be capturing pieces of the conversation, and you'll see that pop up on the screen, and then at the end you will see sort of a visual representation of the conversation that we've had today. So definitely keep an eye out for that as the event progresses. We will have a fireside chat at the beginning of the event, and then we will be joined by a panel at which we'll have the opportunity to dig in even deeper to these topics. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm now pleased to be joined by Fidel Ndame, who is the Deputy President of AGRA. Fidel, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you for having me, Teresa.
Well, morning for me, afternoon for you.
Absolutely.
And for our audience around the world, whatever time it may be. I'm so pleased to be here talking with you today, specifically about smallholder farmers in Africa, such an important part of the food system and a really important piece of thinking about adaptability, resilience, and sustainability. And those solutions need to be gotten right if smallholder farmers in Africa are going to have the future that we need them to have. So tell us a little bit about how AGRA is thinking about this issue in helping African smallholders adapt and build resilience in the face of climate change and other challenges that they're experiencing right now.
Thank you, Teresa, for a great question. First, let me say that as an alliance for African transformation, food system transformation, AGRA is completely focused on supporting smallholder farmers in the context of market-led and size-driven transformation agenda. And I think we take cognizance that Africa is a huge continent with a very diverse farming system. So when we think of solution, we need to keep that in mind. But I think what we have in common is the recognition that things are not going well. I mean, overall, I mean, none of the African countries will meet the SDGs. And COVID-19 that happened in 2019 actually brought to the fore how fragile our food systems are. And partly because the way we are approaching it in trying to, on the one hand, increase production, provide nutritious food, provide jobs, but considering them in separate framework doesn't work. So I think the opportunity and the silver lining of that crisis is to start rethinking in new terms around how to support smallholder farmers. So I'll just say two main points here. First, they recognize the role they play now. They produce most of the food that we eat on the continent. So they're doing quite well. And related to that, I have to say that the last 25 years, actually, the continent recorded the biggest increase in production and production than any other region in the world, the last 25 years. But most of this production happened through increased area, not in a sustainable way. I think that speaks to the challenge that we are trying to address today. Therefore, as we consider solution, including nature-based solution, we need to appreciate the complexity and the magnitude of the problem and really espouse a resilience framework that recognizes that you need government investment, you need state capability and leadership. You need to have a system, private sector-led system that enable access to knowledge, information, and services to smallholder farmers, including finance. And then all of this will be supporting producers across different agroecologies to pursue their own production and productivity agenda. So it's a three-layered system. It's not only a smallholder problem. It's a system play. And I think from that point of view, the UN Food System Summit reminded us that you don't deal with complex issue by only focusing on simple solutions.
Yeah, it definitely isn't everyone problem, right? It's not just a farmer's problem because they're feeding the entire continent. So if the problem isn't solved, you know, people don't have enough to eat. I was really interested to hear you sort of lay out, you know, all the actors that need to be involved here. So you have governments that have to be buying in, you know, departments of ag, and not even just that, you know, if we're thinking about sort of a multi-sectoral approach with nutrition issues, and, you know, how you can get all of that, various ministries involved there. Private sector, of course, you know, companies that are in all pieces of the food system and ensuring, you know, farmers have inputs that they need, as well as their crops are able to actually get to a market to be sold at the end of the supply chain. And then donors as well, you know, the financing that you mentioned. So and the funding. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about how you see those three buckets, I guess, interacting currently, and what changes might need to be made to make that collaboration more effective.
Thanks, Teresa. I think that's really the crucial question. Firstly, we need to understand what is broken now, because otherwise we'll be answering questions that are not asked. I think the inclusive agricultural transformation we're trying to achieve, we're seeking all to contribute to, that really meet those requirements of productivity, sustainable productivity, income, but also livelihood improvement for smallholder farmers and consumers, will require that we recognize that we need to fix the following problem. Firstly, inadequate public investment, because a significant part of the solution is to avail appropriate technologies, extension services, and infrastructure. This comes from government. Unless government does it, it's very difficult for the private sector or the smallholder farmer to do it. Second major problem are weak institution and policy and regulatory framework. You know, it's one thing to make a policy, but can you execute it and really account for it? Thirdly, there are significant breakdown in the value chain. And to put it simply, people producing what the market doesn't need, and countries being obliged to import food while you have significant proportion of our population in agriculture. So not aligning the demand to the production potential and what farmers are doing. And finally, very limited private sector involvement. Now, given this range of problems, it means you need an orchestrated approach to the solution. Firstly, leadership has to come from government in setting a longer-term vision that is not only about 2-3 years, but that really can take multi-generational horizon and see what kind of investment needs to be made, mainly in research. Because agriculture is actually an art of locality. There's no blueprint. I cannot take a variety from South Africa and take it to Senegal. So you basically need to build a context-specific solution to the specific challenge. This is why it's really important to have public investment on research, on extension, but also on roads, on infrastructure in general. Once those investments are made, it creates an incentive for the private sector, especially if you have the right policy for them now coming to troubleshoot the solution. And obviously, one of the problems if you deal with smallholder-based agriculture is issue of fragmentation and therefore high transaction costs. Put simply, you have a large number of small producers who are undercapitalized and are scattered in wide geographies. So the cost of servicing them or doing business with them is very high. And this is why working with the private and government, we're considering about having platform that can bulk aggregating so that you can minimize the transaction cost. So, and in that context, when farmers are given specific incentive and information, they know what to do. They know their land, they know the market, they can pursue the opportunity. And this is why you really need to apply an active subsidiarity principle. Farmer will do what they need to do once they get the support, the information, the financing, and the market. But this requires that you have a layer of private sector. This is why at AGRA we talk about system playing. You know, basically where you can de-risk, because one private sector cannot do it alone, because it's too. This is why at AGRA we have been supporting consortia, where we bring together a set of actors who can really de-risk the whole value chain and create the condition for an increased production and productivity. Now, Teresa, one thing I want to add, and that probably came from the UN Food Systems Summit, is the focus on the need to not only to produce food, but to deliver healthy diets for all. So it adds a new dimension, which is not only about production, it's all about nutrition and environmental sustainability. And I think the practical implication of that is we cannot afford to work in silos. You need cooperation. But this cooperation has to be led by a vision, and this is why African countries at the highest level, at the continent level, has come to a common position on how to address the UN food systems, recommendation and resolution. And these are completely consistent with the continent's own framework, like NEPAD, the CADEP, the Comprehensive Agricultural Development Plan, but also the Malabo Declaration. I think what needs to happen is now to strengthen the capacity of countries to enable a resilient-driven agricultural system that really unleash the potential of smallholder farmers. And the good news is most technology already exists. The bigger problem is how do you bring them at the doorstep of farmers using digital, and this is part of the silver lining that COVID-19 showed us, that when our collective survival was at stake, we were able to cooperate, to share data, share information, to address the solution. For me, the greatest opportunity now of COP26 and UN Food Systems Summit is how can we bring back those governance platforms that enable us to cooperate in order to solve the problem collectively.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought in the technology piece. That's something I would love to talk a little bit about here in our minutes remaining, and sort of how you're seeing that as key to this progress that, as you just so eloquently described, needs to be made with smallholder farmers in Africa. I've been in the field primarily in Latin America, actually, and seen some what are quite cool technological inventions and apps on smartphones and things like that, giving farmers information that they previously didn't have access to. But as you said, just because it exists doesn't mean that people have it or that they know how to use it. And, obviously there are still some issues with connectivity, obviously huge explosion of smartphones in the developing world, but not every farmer has one. How are you thinking about those barriers that do remain, that again, we did see with COVID as well, and, all of these digital and technological solutions that exist, but aren't necessarily always in the hands of the people that need them?
Well, thank you, Teresa, for a great question again. And I think the technology discussion should really be informed by understanding of the condition, the changing condition. And I mean, we talk about climate change, drought, flood, etc. Then it becomes extremely important to have access to a very specific drought tolerant, early maturing, pest and disease resistant variety. This is a specific product deliverable that comes out of the research system to enable farmers to be able to optimize their production within the new condition. Use of water efficiency technology. I mean, there is a very famous quote, plant needs water, not rain. Because if you rely on rainfall, I mean, in this part of the world, in the Sahel, in 10 years, you have at least 7 years of drought. So you understand why relying solely on rainfall, rain-fed agriculture will not do it. So we will need to invest in water retention and management. Third level of type of technology has to do with post-harvest management techniques. Because the evidence is from 20 to 30% of everything that is produced is being lost from the farm to the consumer. I think addressing those issues would be extremely important. Now, to do it in a very specific way, and we need really to use the latest technology to come up with weather-based and yield-based crop insurance. You need to have new financial products so that people can be protected against those variability. Practically, you also need soil map, because you really need to optimize to match the genetic potential to the local context. Because once you understand the specific characteristics of the soil, you can come up not only with the right variety, but also with specific fertilizer. you only apply what is needed. It can be manure, it can be, it's not, doesn't have to be kept, but you need to know what is efficient in the soil so that I stop depleting the soil as I produce. Agroecological principles are extremely important, which is basically respecting the interaction between the human being, the environment, and making sure that we are also really caring for the long-term survival and renewal of the ecological capital. And finally, all of this can happen if you have policies. Because remember, all these actors operate with incentives provided by policy and institution, especially the MSMEs, the micro and small medium enterprises, typically women-driven and youth-led. I think that help us also address the inclusivity agenda, which is crucial in the continent, given the demographics. I think that gives us an opportunity. If we can leverage the digital revolution, the demographic dividend, and manage the climate change challenges, I think that put us in a pathway of a much more successful agricultural transformation.
Well, I think that's the perfect way to end, Fidel, on that opportunity and thinking ahead about what is possible. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure speaking with you. And in the panel that's following this, I'll have the opportunity to dig even further into these issues, but this was such a great scene setter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Teresa. I mean, I know if I had one more minute, I would just say that there's a lot of discussion around finance and financial product, green. All of this is very relevant, but just let's remember, finance is solving a specific problem. We should make sure that all these tools are being produced within the framework that address what we have just discussed. Context-specific, farmer-driven, but within an ecosystem that can provide resilience, profitability, so that we meet the requirement of people, planet, and prosperity. I thank you again for the opportunity, Teresa.
Thank you so much. I'm now so pleased to welcome to the stage our panelists, with which we are going to have the opportunity to explore this conversation in even more depth. I'm pleased to be joined today by Noura Aman, who's the program manager for RED+2 at Farm Africa. Sarah Farley, Managing Director of Integrated Operations at the Food Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. And Ndidi Wunweli, expert in social innovation and managing partner for Sahel Consulting on agriculture and nutrition. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. I also want to put in a couple of notes for our audience as we get started with this panel discussion. We've had an active chat so far in the Zoom. I'm so happy to see that. We're hoping to have a couple of moments at the end of the panel to take questions from our audience. So if you do have some, feel free to put those in the chat along with the particular panelist that you may want to be directing the question to, and we will hopefully get to those questions. I also want to check in on our illustrator, Chris, who has been in the background and was listening in on the first part of the event and illustrating what has been happening. So keep an eye out for that throughout the event, and we will be able to see sort of the representation of the conversation so far in a visual way. I think this is a really cool aspect of this event, and we will have the whole thing filled out by the end of this panel, and we'll sort of have a comprehensive look at everything that we talked about today. So thanks again to our panelists for being here. So many great points brought up by Fidel in that fireside chat. Really excited to sort of dive in on those deeper now with the three of you. I'd like to start out talking pretty broadly. Fidel and I had the opportunity to get into some of the specifics, but I'd love to hear from you, from the three of you, each of you where you sit, how organizations all around the world and in Africa can be collaborating to create technological and other solutions for sustainable and nature positive, climate focused agricultural future for smallholders. I think we all have to remember, we just saw COP wrap this week. It's hard to believe that was still just this week. There's so much going on. Everyone has been so busy in these days, but maybe Sarah, we'll come to you first. And I would love to hear a little bit of your perspective on this and how the Rockefeller Foundation is thinking about this.
Thank you, Teresa, and so wonderful to be on this panel with such extraordinary colleagues and experts, and to hear that fabulous fireside chat with Fidel, who raised so many really critical points. So, when I think about what is it organizations really need to embrace nature positive solutions, I think one of the things that's holding us back from doing this is actually shared consensus on a couple of the key terms that Fidel raised, one of them being the agroecological approaches stroke regenerative. What is that? What are the metrics that we use to define and hold to account producers and companies that are producing in that way? And therefore, without those metrics, we are really not seeing the tidal wave of, I think, the global capital that will start to shift in that direction. So I think that's one of the things we need to collaborate on, not just as large NGOs, but as producers, as investors, as researchers, as experts, and most centrally as farmers. We need to hold hands and really establish a consensus, harmonized definition of regenerative. Similarly, I think, if we look at the prospects for achieving a 1.5 degree world, there's a wonderful piece that the WWF released going into COP that really broke down what do we need to do in the food domain to achieve our 1.5. And it's a mix, right, of shifting production techniques, reducing food loss and waste, and shifting to diets. Well, when it comes to that third point, which we heard Fidel raise, there is also no standardized definition of what we mean by a healthy, sustainable diet. There's some wonderful efforts that have put forward ideas there, including Eat Lancet. But in terms of a shared data set and metrics that let us evaluate country by country, state by state, district by district, how our diets both nourish our bodies and help support and steward the resources of the planet, that isn't there. And I think until we harmonize and build that consensus, we're really not going to move in lockstep on that critical dimension of achieving a more nature positive future. So some wonderful initiatives, I think, are underway on this, but we need to get much more serious in the run up to COP27.
Sarah, I love those points that you made about vocabulary and definitions of, what do we all mean when we say these words? You mentioned agroecology, which was a contentious topic around the UN Food System Summit that we also saw in September. So I think you're so right. It's like, what do these words mean? And are we all using them but meaning different things? Which isn't going to be effective if people aren't on the same page. So I think that's a really, really great point that you make. And, it applies to the wider development sphere too, right? We use all these catchphrases and all these words, and at some point, sometimes you lose what we're actually talking about, which could be a little bit ridiculous. So Ndidi, let's come to you next. And I'd love to hear sort of your big picture take, and then maybe your response on that question too, about semantics, about the language that we use when we are talking about these issues and why that's so important.
Thank you so much. And I think Fidel covered so many critical issues in his fireside, so well done. Clearly, I feel a sense of urgency as we think about the future, not just of Africa, but of the whole world, and the need for cross-sector engagement in, first of all, defining what the biggest challenges are and then agreeing on the prioritization. And I know that I come from the private sector lens, and I do believe that the private sector has a critical role to play from a sustainability perspective. Government can create an enabling environment, and we saw the FSS, lots of huge, large promises and targets. Civil society and foundations can come in with catalytic funding to push us, but ultimately it's the private sector that will implement and ensure demand-driven, long-term solutions, but they have to make business sense. So as we're defining what the challenges are and agreeing on common language, we have to simplify what this common language is. And, I actually admire a lot of the work that the Rockefeller Foundation has been doing around the true cost of food. And when you look at globally, the cost of what it will take for us to change behavior in the private sector, it has to make business sense, as I said. So shifting behavior to address some of the critical steps required will mean that, number one, we have to think about what incentives or disincentives exist, and how we can also get consumers to be huge sources of forceful changes required. So yes, we haven't all agreed on common terminology. We haven't all agreed on a way forward, but I think there are pockets of hope. I am always an optimist, and I see through my work at Sahel Consulting and Nourishing Africa and ACE Foods that companies, especially SMEs that get it, are starting to change behavior. And if they change behavior, it influences who they source from, how they engage with farmers, how they engage with their consumers from a nutrition perspective, what they prioritize in terms of spending and conservation, and what they communicate to the broader ecosystem. So, we can get into specifics, but those are just some high-level thoughts.
Thanks so much, Ndidi. Now, Nura, I'd like to come to you for that question on, sort of this broad picture and how you're looking at this issue of nature positive production in Africa.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really, I am very much happy to participate in this very critical, important event. And I really agree with what the previous speaker has said. And in fact, in order to be be effective in this nature-based solution, the first thing is that we need to really think of is we have to understand the local knowledge of the communities. Because the community, they know how really to manage the nature-based solutions. And we need to recognize those local indigenous knowledge in order to solve these nature-based solutions. Because, nowadays we are now suffering from the same issues globally, like the global hot is now increasing, and this is really affecting the production, and also this is really affecting the life of the people, so that the local community, they have the indigenous knowledge on how they can involve it and how they can contribute. So really we have to think of how we need to engage them whenever we are doing whatever we are doing, whether it is project or whether it is a national based program. We have to consider their knowledge. That is what really we need to think of. And the other thing is we really need to have a system that we can have information sharing, especially like the one you are doing is really very important. We can know, we can really understand what is going in different corridors, and we can learn from that, and we can maybe select and replicate that all important things. Like what I see in the COP is there are a lot of things that people are really doing. If we comprehensively just put all those things together and share across the globe, that is really works, and it is very important for all of us to just solve this problem. And the other is, like we need to have, especially in African context, we have policies, but the problem is we can't enforce all those policies at the grassroots levels. So the government, all those who have actually working on these policy issues, they have to be really very committed, and that they have to also enforce those policies at the grassroots levels. We develop different policies that really help us to solve these all problems, but the problem is it didn't come to the ground. It has to come to the ground. It has to solve the problem.
Thank you so much for that, Nura. I love your point about everything that's already happening. In the context of COP, you have all of these people, the three of you, your organizations, the people that you work with. There is this massive movement of people that are working on these issues, and we saw a lot of them come together at COP. And, can those people be making the difference? Some folks were disappointed with what the, official statements were from the leaders, and that there wasn't more concrete action from countries on the country level. But there was so many connections being made between organizations, people joining up and thinking about things in that way. So I think that's such a spectacular point. And I was really struck at this COP with, sort of the amount of attention that was on it, which I think obviously speaks to the urgency that we're all feeling around this issue. And, you have all these organizations coming together, and that is actually going to be the thing that makes the difference and get smallholder farmers in Africa the tools that they need to be adapting and be more resilient. So that is such an excellent point. Sarah, I wanted to come back to you because I was just thinking about how, we've been using the phrase nature positive so far in this conversation. And, maybe we should define that. It reminds me of what you were saying in terms of, the words that we're using and what do we all mean by them. What is nature positive production, and why is that a frame for this conversation and something that we need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, we're zeroed in a little bit tighter actually on the phrasing of regenerative agriculture. So I'll start there, which right now has four dimensions, and then that for which there's, I would say, tighter consensus, and then there are other dimensions where it's a bit more contentious. So the four dimensions where there's tighter consensus include sequestration of soil carbon, sequestration of above ground carbons, that could be in trees, what have you, biodiversity, preservation of biodiversity, and then utilization of water. There are other factors, which is that they are sociocultural and socioeconomic. And I think that's where the intersection, but not complete degree to which they are synonymous of regenerative and agroecological, there's some contestation there. And I think that's going to be really important to tease out, that nature positive doesn't just leave behind the considerations of improving livelihoods, improving equity, improving gender. No, that those are actually baked in. Those socioeconomic, sociocultural dimensions are part of being nature positive. But I'll say an effort that I'm quite inspired by is one called Regen 10, which is starting to bring together farmers groups, business groups, investors, and technical experts that have been looking at these definitions for a long time to start to look at that Venn diagram of how these definitions align. And I'm very hopeful that actually within the next year to 2 years, that effort connected with that of many others, including CFS and its agroecological principles, which were laid out, will actually offer up something that will give you a more concrete answer to this very important question, Teresa.
We will definitely all have our eye out for that, for the definition that maybe can guide these conversations in the future. Ndidi, I want to come back to you to talk a little bit more in depth about the private sector perspective on all of this. And, what were some of your impressions for, the way that private sector played a role in the COP that we just saw, and what changes, improvements do you want to be seeing as we really dig down now, getting into action and ensuring that, the statements that people are making and that this sort of energy coming out of COP continues, particularly when it relates to the private sector?
Thank you so much. I would say that when we think about the private sector, oftentimes you don't realize that farmers are part of the private sector. So farmers sometimes might be micro or small businesses, but we have farmers that span micro to large. Then we have SMEs, those are the agro processors, the logistics providers, all through the ecosystem. And then we have medium and large businesses. And all three categorizations have a critical role to play. I saw quite a few engagements and dialogues with all three groups at COP. But I would like to just draw out some key challenges. The first is this concept of greenwashing. We see that in the nutrition community as well, where a lot of large companies make commitments, some commitments very lofty, with very minimal M&E and accountability. And so we have to, work very closely with civil society and the foundation world to ensure that we hold big business accountable. They have a critical role to play in changing behavior, but also signaling. Now, many of them, as you know, have large corporate affairs departments and can lobby governments in their favor. So I'm calling on civil society, hold them accountable, to have clear matrix tied to clear deliverables. Don't tell me 45% reduction of what? What does that mean? What's the baseline? Where are we starting from? So that's one. And we have this in the nutrition space as well. Oh, we're going to reduce salt and sugar content by 40%. What is your baseline? What's the end line? And what are the steps required? So that's one for large and big businesses. The second, for small and medium-sized enterprises, is the importance of industry associations and trade associations. We desperately need them to play a critical role. SMEs are fragmented across the ecosystem. So how are we holding and strengthening these industry and trade associations to be those conduits? And what incentives are we creating with those groups? And then for farmers, I think it's really, really important leveraging digital, like Fadel talked about, but also setting standards and incentives. And I'm very impressed with some governments, like the Indian government, creating incentives for farmers to change behavior. Because we can say everything about carbon farming, but I tell you, most farmers I work with in Nigeria don't know what carbon farming is. They're not benefiting from carbon farming. They're not taking advantage of it. So there's a huge divide in information, knowledge. There's a huge knowledge asymmetry, and this divide cannot continue. We need to ensure that farmers across the board have the same access to information and incentives to change behavior. And if there is money to be shared and money to be made, that information has to be widely known and accessible. And this is where NGOs play a role, this is where governments play a role, and this is where our partners across the board play a role. So I really encourage a broad-based partnership, but also accountability across the board.
Indeed, that is one of my favorite topics, accountability. I love talking about what the metrics are, what they should be, and how we're gauging success. I think you made such a spectacular point about how, we see this greenwashing, we see these announcements being made. What does this mean? What are you talking about when you say this? If you're reducing sugar, reducing fat, or anything like that, what does that actually mean? What are the baselines? And also, who's watching when we see governments make these types of announcements, at COP or around these international moments that we have? Who's actually checking in 6 months, a year to ensure that companies are doing that? I think that's such a great point. Here's our illustration live. We have an opportunity to see our artist at work. This is really cool. I'm really enjoying this. And we'll have the opportunity to see it at the end as well. Noura, I want to come back to you to respond to something Ndidi just said in terms of the information that farmers have on the ground. And, we can be having all of these conversations in these fora, in events like this at COP, but, what do people on the ground, the farmers that we're seeing, whether it's where you are in Ethiopia or anywhere else in Africa, what are they thinking, and how are they connecting their reality, whether it's increased pests that they're seeing, other impacts of climate change with rainfall and things like that? How do you ensure that these sort of broader conversations we have are actually linking to, what farmers need on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. This is one of the things that we really think to connect farmers to the realities. Mostly, the people at the grassroots level, they don't have an access to informations. And because of that, they are always, at the back, and they couldn't actually make all those things need to be happen. So what good thing that we need to really do is we have to really create an access system for the information for the farmers to get to that information in order to act. Like mostly because of like we are in Africa, and most of the farmers, they are living in far areas, so they don't have an access to internet, and they don't have an access to different information systems. So really, we have to think on the way that we really reach them to have that access, to have that information. So in that way, they can make the real changes that we really need. That is one thing. The other is we have to really capacitate them. When I say we have to capacitate them, like I can raise very wonderful example that we have when we are actually managing the natural ecosystem conservation. We created the PFM cooperatives, and we link with the government, and they have signed an agreement to cooperate to co-manage the natural resources. So we train them, and we really see that they manage that ecosystems. And because of that, we have the rate that we have actually implemented in the last 10 years, and that really we tested, and we see the changes on the ground in terms of the ecosystem conservation, in terms of even the emission reduction. They have managed to reduce the emission reduction of 10.12 million tons of carbon dioxide, and they sold that emission reduction to the voluntary market. So with that, you can see when you really to come closer to them and to work with them, you can really see the changes. So that is the way we really think and engage them to see the real changes. The other thing, farmers, they need support, not like the support actually we are thinking. We have to show the way that they can do things. They can easily manage the things once we are actually closer to them, and they show how to manage that. The other thing is there is a disconnection between the government and the community. This has to be really solved. There has to be an alignment in which they can cooperatively work with in each other. Like, for example, we have the RED Plus implementation in one of the region in Ethiopia. Then they manage all the implementation as the ground. But when they came to the benefit sharing systems, there is something which is not really transparent. There is something that the government or the other peoples are actually hiding from it. So that will, minimize their commitment to engage in all those things. So if we solve all these things, really we can manage, and we can see the real changes that we really looking for.
Nora, I wanted to ask you as well, as we sort of zoom out on this issue a little bit, why are we even talking about the importance of smallholder farmers? How does this connect to the issue of food security in Africa in terms of the situation that we're seeing right now? I know Madagascar is one example of a very, very concerning hunger situation that is the direct result of climate change. So, you're there in Ethiopia, but there are other countries in Africa that are also experiencing really direct impacts from climate change on the ability of farmers to feed their population. So when we're thinking about this issue, how do we need to be sure that we are connecting it to that wider goal and that food security piece as well?
Yes, exactly. Well, not only even in Madagascar, even in most of the African countries, we have seen that farmers, the smallholder farmers, they are really suffering from these climate change effects, and this is because of it's not because of the climate change, but the climate change is something that we can change if we can really bring some sort of solutions and work with them. That is where actually we lack. Like I can say, when we say the farmers disconnected from the information, we said there has to be like formal systems that they can have access. For example, you can have an extension system through the government in which the government can share different information so that they can aware of everything and that they can make themselves ready to act for the changes, including those of the drought. We have to have like the systems in which we can really aware them, alert them, and be ready to act. So that way, actually, we can really manage. I remember one of the programs that we have been implemented for the last 10 years, which is PSNP program. There is a component that the farmers can have access systems, the access system for information, so that they can aware of all what is coming and what is really going on, and they can be really ready to act. So that way we can support them. We have to establish that system. That system actually comes through the government policy, and also that system also not only the government. There has to be some private sectors that can support, even the donor, the private sector, the NGOs, the research centers. All this has to be engaged to support all those things, to establish those whole systems, to make the farmers really aware of all those things and to act accordingly.
Ndidi, I'd love to bring you in on that policymaking piece and sort of how you see the private sector role being involved in that as well. But when we think about, policies, regulation, and, the role of the government and working with the business community to make sure that there are incentives for farmers and that they're getting the access they need, what challenges are there in doing that? And what are some maybe bright spots that we have of places that have been effective at using policies, regulation to have the government collaborating with the private sector?
Yeah, thank you so much. I really believe climate smart policies from government is critical, and the requisite incentives as well, or disincentives. And I'll give you a few examples from our landscape. So I work very closely with farmers in the dairy sector, the yam seed system, the cassava seed system, basically leveraging SMEs in the value chain as the catalytic change agents. And with our dairy program, which is called Advancing Local Dairy Development in Nigeria, from the onset, we realized we needed a cohesive dairy policy. And this is where, when we talk about ecosystem solutions with unusual actors in the room, we created a National Advisory Council and invited the Central Bank, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Agriculture, Women Affairs, Health, and they all have a seat on this advisory council. The first thing we noticed is that every single agency was creating its own dairy policy. And most of these dairy policies, as you know, dairy is a huge contributor to the climate problems. And if we don't address sustainability dairy farming in many of our countries, we're exacerbating the climate issues that we face. And in our country, dairy has become problematic because with climate change and the drying of the Lake Chad region, farmers have had to become more nomadic. And so we have a huge problem with farmers grazing across the country, which has led to, significant fights between, crop farmers and dairy farmers. So we really required all the agencies to come up with a cohesive dairy strategy. So our project basically said, okay, Central Bank, Ministry of Trade and Investment, Ministry of Agriculture, we need one cohesive dairy policy. And this has really been amazing to get all the usual actors who normally sit in silos talking to each other and involving the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Environment, all of the usual actors. That's the first thing. Cohesive policies that are streamlined, that are supportive of each other, and that have a climate and gender lens from the onset. And where that does not exist, private sector has to almost propel it. So beyond the policies, we have also strengthened the Commercial Dairy Ranchers Association of Nigeria, because we need the industry associations, the trade associations, the farmer associations working with the policy landscape and collaborating. We actually incubated and strengthened this association in our office. Because if you don't have those strong industry associations, when the donor funding dries up, nothing happens, right? And then beyond that, at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, you need champions. And you need champions that are unusual champions. You need the religious leaders. You need the chiefs and the traditional rulers. So we've seen that to really have lasting change and impact and to change behavior, you need the policy environment. But you need the associations, you need the trade industry associations, but then you need the private sector companies who are ultimately going to buy the milk. And so we have this private sector-led dairy development program where the private companies are also contributing, securing their own supply chain and ensuring that it's sustainable, it's just, it's equitable. And that also makes business sense, right? Because if you're guaranteed a regular supply of milk and it's hygienic and it involves women, it's gender sensitive, it's environmentally sustainable, the entire ecosystem works. Is it easy? No. Has it been messy? Very messy. And I just want to say that it can be done. It takes a while, but it takes political will. It takes private sector commitment. It takes resources from funders, and it takes a whole movement to drive change. And we're doing it in Nigeria. So I believe it can be done elsewhere.
I think that's such a great bright spot, Didi, and a place that we can all look to for examples for how this can be done well. We have just under 10 minutes left, and we've had quite the active chat in this event, which is great. I don't know if our panelists have had the opportunity to sort of look on the side here for all the things that everyone's chatting about. We hopefully can take a couple of questions, so feel free to put those in if you have them. One of the comments, though, I found really interesting, and Sarah, I'm curious to get your reaction to this. They write, our 4 generations world existed only around the villages, and indigenous knowledge successfully managed their surroundings. Now the world has become a large village. We need knowledge management that's effective for this large village to enable these rural farmers to manage their environment sustainably.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a great comment because it's speaking to the need for knowledge not only to exist, but to be accessible, and then really critically important, meaningful. I mean, look at climate data. We have this giant challenge of downscaling. How do you take these trend lines and the complexities that kind of hover above the individual on the ground, making tough choices every day, given the rains didn't come, given the inputs became more expensive? How do we get data in the hands of farmers to make the best choices possible? I mean, I think this is something where there is activity, there is action. There's some really interesting kind of online platforms that are trying to make that translation effect come all the way down into the hands of farmers via their cooperatives, via their cell phones. But still, I think it's not been totally sorted out. I'll say one initiative that's gotten me excited in the last couple of years is the food systems dashboard. And I was really intrigued to see how that was also being rolled into the UN Food Systems Summit National Dialogues. For those who aren't familiar with it, The Food Systems Dashboard is an initiative of Johns Hopkins and GAIN and now others as well. And it's basically taking, to Nditi's point, the kind of data that the Ministry of Health tends to look at around, NCDs, et cetera, the kind of data the Ministry of Environment is used to looking at, Ministry of Labor, and it's wrapping it all up into what I would call food systems vital signs. And what's really exciting, you can go today for free to the Food Systems Dashboard and you can do comparisons between countries, regions, and it puts in relief issues like diet quality against the cost of inputs, national food systems budget sheet. So I think we're starting to get some of these tools that allow our brains to see multiple signals together. And that's what it takes, going all the way back to the beginning and Fadel's comments, that operating in systems is not about silver bullets and it's not about one leverage point. It's about understanding multiple leverage points simultaneously. And that's a big ask because it's very complicated. Frankly, it's complex. And so I think we need our data, our dashboards, our signaling, and our translation to meet the moment of the complexity demanded to operate in a nature positive way.
Sarah, that's such a great point about data. And I think it does all come back to that, right? About what information we have, what information we still need, but then how we get that to people and how they either get the information that we do already have and share it in an effective way. And how do we hear their voices about what information we might not have that they want, that they need to be able to solve whatever problem it is that they're seeing, whether that's a farmer on the ground or a small and medium-sized business, or one issue we haven't touched on at all in this conversation yet is food loss and waste. And I'm actually working on an article right now about a new database that's collating research about food loss and waste so that people can go in and get information, about their context, about a particular crop, a particular region, compare to other parts of the world, see what's working there, and, hopefully spur more knowledge management, more knowledge sharing when it comes to this issue. But I think that is a huge challenge, is this data. And Fadel had mentioned this too, you have technology, you have data, but it's really getting it into the hands of people that need it and can actually be using it too. That's so important. I see a question about the database. I'm actually writing an article about that, so we'll be sure that folks see that. It should be coming out next week. I'll also give a little plug now. You will find it in Devex Dish, which is Devex's food systems newsletter. So I think you all had the opportunity to sign up for Dish when you registered for this event, but we'll also be putting the link to that in the chat. So we'd love to have you join us. Join that community, and if you'd share with your colleagues and friends that you think might be interested in that would be really great. And I will ensure that folks have access to all of those things. We definitely would love to have you join us. We've got just a couple of minutes left. I'd love to take one last look at our illustration of this conversation. I think this is such a cool thing happening. See, we can see it happening there live. This is so neat. I love this. And I'm hoping we're going to be able to share this with you all afterwards, if there's a way to capture this when we send you all the wrap-up emails. So hopefully we will be able to share it so that everyone can sort of see what it is that we talked about. This is such a fun way to summarize. We have just 1 minute left. One thing that we didn't talk about at all is the context of COVID. So Nura, I want to come to you really quickly and just, we had the opportunity to talk about the, obviously the importance of what smallholder farmers are experiencing when it comes to climate change, but give us just a really quick view of, what you saw when it came to COVID and how that really heightens the need for us to accelerate changes when it comes to nature positive agriculture and really developing solutions to these problems.
Yeah, in fact, this COVID has actually affected a lot the production and the marketing systems. The live example that we really tested last year, we produced a coffee that has to be sent to Europe. But because of this COVID, we couldn't actually send that. There is a distortion of the market systems. So we really think on how we can manage those all things, because farmers are actually producing. They want us to they used to sell those oil products, and they have to link it to international markets. So these all are actually affecting them to produce as far as their plan. So we have to really work on how we need to manage all those things, especially for the smallholder farmers, those who are actually producing their products. And the other thing that we really think of this COVID issue is actually it affects especially the producing forces when actually we don't think of how we really manage all those things, because they are the one who are actually producing the food. And we need to think on how actually we can address all those things regarding the market, as well as regarding the distribution of these commodities across the globe.
I think that's such a great way to end this conversation, Nura, a reminder that how all of these things are so connected, and why it is that we care. It all connects back to food security and people having access to safe, affordable, nutritious food in their community. We are at time for this event. Thank you so much, Nura and Didi, Sarah, for joining us. This was such a great conversation. Thanks to Fidel for being with us for the fireside chat. I really appreciate you, our audience, being with us. Such a robust chat in the Zoom. I hope you all had a chance to make some connections that will be useful to your work going forward. Thank you to our presenting partner, AGRA. It was a pleasure doing this event with you. And thanks so much to our audience. It was great having you tune in from all over, and we hope to see you at another Devex event soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.